Vanessa Blake thought she had just escorted an insignificant woman out of her boutique, but in less than an hour, she would realize she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The glass doors of L'Etoile Boutique shimmered under the late afternoon sun on Madison Avenue, reflecting a world of polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and carefully curated luxury that whispered exclusivity with every detail. Inside, soft jazz floated through the air, mingling with the faint scent of designer perfume, as women in tailored dresses browsed racks that held price tags higher than most monthly rents. And then the door opened. Emily Carter stepped inside quietly, almost as if she didn't want to disturb the perfection of the space. She wore a simple cream cardigan, slightly worn at the cuffs, a pair of dark jeans, and flat shoes that had clearly seen years of use. Her hair was tied back in a loose, practical ponytail, and her face carried no makeup beyond what nature had given her. To most eyes, she didn't belong here. Vanessa Blake noticed her immediately, standing behind the polished counter in a fitted black dress and heels that clicked sharply against the marble. Vanessa had trained herself to assess customers within seconds. It was a skill she took pride in, the ability to separate serious clients from what she privately called window shoppers. Her gaze swept over Emily from head to toe, lingering just a moment too long on the scuffed edges of her shoes. A subtle smile curved at the corner of Vanessa's lips, one that never reached her eyes. Emily paused just inside the entrance, taking in the store with a quiet, thoughtful gaze. She ran her fingers lightly along a rack of silk dresses, feeling the fabric with an appreciation that came from familiarity, not awe. There was no hesitation in her movements, no nervous glancing around, just a calm presence that contrasted sharply with how out of place she appeared. Vanessa approached, her posture straight, her tone smooth but cool. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, though the question carried an undertone that suggested the opposite. Emily turned, offering a small, polite smile. "Yes, I'm looking for a dress. Something elegant, but simple." Vanessa nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Of course," she replied, her voice measured. "Our pieces start at around $2,000. The number hung in the air, deliberate, like a quiet warning. Emily didn't react. She simply nodded once, as if the price confirmed nothing more than what she already expected. "That's fine," she said gently. For a brief moment, something flickered across Vanessa's face, confusion perhaps, quickly masked by professionalism. She gestured toward a section near the back, though her movement lacked the enthusiasm she reserved for preferred clients. "You might find something there," she said, already turning slightly away. Around them, a few customers had begun to notice. A woman near the fitting rooms whispered something to her friend, both casting discreet glances toward Emily. The room didn't fall silent, not yet, but there was a subtle shift, an almost imperceptible tightening of attention. Emily walked toward the indicated section, her steps unhurried, her posture steady. She lifted a navy dress from the rack, examining the stitching with a careful eye, as if she understood every detail of its construction. Behind her, Vanessa watched, arms loosely crossed, her expression sharpening. In her mind, the conclusion had already been made, and she was certain, absolutely certain, that this quiet woman standing under the chandelier had no idea where she was or what she was about to walk into. Emily held the navy dress a moment longer than necessary, her fingers tracing the seam with quiet precision, as if she could feel every stitch without looking. And there was something almost deliberate in the way she examined it, not like a shopper hoping to afford it, but like someone who understood exactly what it should be worth. And behind her, Vanessa watched with growing irritation, the kind that came not from one moment, but from a slow accumulation of things that did not quite fit her expectations, because the woman should have hesitated, should have asked about discounts or sizes nervously, should have revealed herself as someone out of place, but she did none of that, and that calmness unsettled her more than anything else. So Vanessa stepped forward again, this time with a sharper edge beneath her polished tone, asking if Emily needed assistance with sizing even though her eyes suggested she already doubted there would be a purchase. And Emily simply shook her head gently, saying she would like to try the dress on, her voice soft but steady. And for a fraction of a second, Vanessa hesitated before pointing toward the fitting rooms in the back, her gesture brief and dismissive as if granting access rather than offering service. And as Emily walked past the mirrored walls, the reflection followed her. Simple clothes surrounded by luxury. A contrast so stark it drew more attention than any bold outfit could have. And the whispers grew just slightly louder, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be felt, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. And one of the sales associates leaned closer to Vanessa, murmuring something that made her lips press into a thin line. And when Emily disappeared behind the curtain of the fitting room, Vanessa exhaled slowly, already forming a conclusion that this situation would need to be handled before it became a scene. Because appearances mattered here, reputation mattered, and allowing the wrong kind of attention could cost more than a single sale. Minutes passed, slow and quiet, the soft jazz continuing as if nothing had changed. But Vanessa kept glancing toward the fitting area, her patience thinning, and when Emily finally stepped out wearing the navy dress, the room shifted in a way no one expected. The fabric fell perfectly against her frame, elegant and understated, transforming her presence from invisible to quietly striking. And for a brief second, even Vanessa was caught off guard, her eyes narrowing as she tried to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed, because the dress did not look like it was wearing Emily. It looked like it belonged to her, like it had been chosen long before she walked through the door. And a nearby customer paused mid-conversation, her gaze lingering just a little too long. But Vanessa recovered quickly, stepping forward with a polite smile that now carried a hint of forced control, commenting that the dress was one of their more exclusive pieces, her voice emphasizing the word exclusive as if drawing a line that Emily was not meant to cross. And Emily nodded again, glancing at her reflection with a thoughtful expression, then asking simply if it was available in another color. And that question, so calm and ordinary, landed harder than any argument could have, because it assumed belonging. It assumed choice. And Vanessa felt something tighten in her chest, a flicker of annoyance turning into something sharper. And she replied that certain items were limited and typically reserved for established clients. The words carefully chosen but unmistakably clear, and the air in the boutique grew heavier. Not loud, not dramatic, just tense in a way that made people listen without turning their heads. And Emily met Vanessa's gaze for a moment, her eyes steady, unreadable, before offering a small, polite smile again, the same one that revealed nothing. And in that silence, something invisible began to shift, something Vanessa did not yet recognize, but something that would soon change everything. Vanessa's smile faded just enough to reveal the edge beneath it, the kind that no longer pretended to be welcoming, but had not yet crossed into open hostility. And she took a small step closer, lowering her voice slightly, as if offering a private courtesy, while ensuring it carried just far enough for others to hear, explaining that their boutique maintained a certain standard of clientele, and that some pieces were not simply purchased, but selected for individuals who represented the brand. And the words settled in the air with a quiet weight, polished yet unmistakably dismissive, and Emily listened without interrupting, her hands resting calmly at her sides as if the comment had not pierced her at all, though the room seemed to tighten around them, the soft jazz now feeling distant compared to the silence forming between each sentence. And a couple near the entrance slowed their browsing, their attention drawn not by noise but by tension, the kind that did not need volume to be felt. And Emily finally spoke, her tone gentle, almost thoughtful, asking if there was a reason she would not be considered one of those clients. And the question, simple as it was, landed with unexpected force, because it required an answer that could no longer hide behind vague professionalism. And Vanessa's expression hardened for just a moment before she smoothed it over again, replying that it was not personal, that it was about maintaining an image, a brand identity, and that sometimes customers misunderstood the nature of exclusive retail environments. And the phrase customers misunderstood carried a subtle emphasis that turned explanation into accusation, and a faint murmur passed through the boutique. Not quite conversation, but not silence either. as if the room itself was reacting, and Emily nodded slowly, absorbing every word without resistance, without defensiveness, which only seemed to unsettle Vanessa more, because there was no reaction to push against, no emotion to dominate, just quiet acceptance that reflected something back she could not control. And then Emily reached up and adjusted the sleeve of the navy dress, her fingers precise and familiar, and she looked at her reflection once more, her gaze steady, as if confirming something to herself rather than seeking approval. And when she turned back, her voice remained calm as she asked if she could proceed with purchasing the dress. And that was the moment Vanessa made her decision. The line between subtle dismissal and open rejection finally crossed, her posture straightening as her tone sharpened just enough to strip away the last layer of courtesy, stating that the boutique reserved the right to refuse service when a situation did not align with their standards. And the words, though delivered smoothly, carried a finality that echoed louder than any raised voice, and the room fell into a deeper silence, the kind that made every movement feel amplified. A hanger sliding on a rack, a quiet breath held too long, and Emily stood there for a second that felt longer than it was, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady on Vanessa's, and then she gave a small nod, almost appreciative, and said softly that she understood. That clarity was always helpful, and there was something in the way she said it that did not sound defeated, did not sound hurt, but instead carried a quiet certainty that did not belong to someone being dismissed, and Vanessa felt it without understanding it, a faint flicker of unease passing through her confidence, quickly pushed aside as she gestured toward the entrance, her hand polite but unmistakable, and Emily turned without protest, stepping out of the dress room to change back into her own clothes. And when she emerged again in her simple cardigan and worn shoes, the contrast returned, but something about it felt different now, as if the simplicity no longer suggested less but concealed something unseen. And as she walked toward the door, the boutique remained silent, every eye aware of what had just happened even if no one spoke it aloud. And just before she reached the exit, Emily paused briefly, not turning back, not raising her voice, simply saying thank you for your honesty in the same calm tone she had used from the beginning. And then she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the glass door closing behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. And inside, Vanessa exhaled slowly, convinced she had just handled a minor inconvenience, unaware that the moment had already set something irreversible into motion. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had happened, taxis gliding past in slow streams of yellow, heels clicking along the sidewalk, conversations blending into the steady rhythm of Manhattan life. And Emily stepped onto the pavement with the same quiet composure she had carried inside, the late afternoon light catching softly on her face as she paused for just a moment, looking down the street as though deciding her next step rather than recovering from what had just occurred. And there was no visible frustration, no anger, just a calm stillness that felt deliberate, almost practiced. And as she reached into her bag, she pulled out her phone, glancing at the screen before typing a short message, her fingers moving with quiet certainty, then slipping the phone back without hesitation, as if whatever she had just set in motion required no further thought, and she began to walk, unhurried, disappearing into the flow of people as seamlessly as she had entered the boutique. While inside, Vanessa returned to the counter, smoothing her dress and adjusting a display of handbags with controlled precision, the brief tension already being filed away in her mind as a minor disruption, something handled, something resolved. And yet the atmosphere had not fully settled, a faint unease lingering in the air like the echo of a sound that had already faded. One of the younger associates approached cautiously, asking if everything was all right, and Vanessa gave a small, confident nod, explaining that some individuals simply did not understand the level of exclusivity required in their environment. Her tone firm, reassuring, almost rehearsed, and the associate nodded, though her eyes flickered toward the door as if something about the situation did not sit entirely right. And a customer near the fitting rooms quietly resumed browsing, but her movements were slower now, more deliberate, as though replaying what she had witnessed. And time passed, minutes slipping by, the boutique gradually returning to its polished routine. Transactions resumed, soft laughter returned, and Vanessa allowed herself a small sense of satisfaction, believing she had protected the brand, maintained the standard, reinforced the invisible boundary that defined their clientele. And then, 45 minutes later, the light outside shifted slightly as the sun dipped lower, casting longer reflections across the glass storefront. And a sleek black SUV turned the corner, its presence subtle but unmistakably refined, moving with a quiet authority that did not demand attention yet commanded it anyway. It slowed as it approached the boutique, coming to a smooth, controlled stop directly in front of the entrance. And for a moment nothing happened. Just the engine idling softly, the reflection of the vehicle stretching across the glass like a shadow. And inside, one of the customers glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized the make, the kind of vehicle rarely seen without purpose. And the younger associate followed her gaze, curiosity pulling her attention toward the street, while Vanessa remained focused on the counter, unaware that the calm she had just reclaimed was already beginning to fracture. And then the rear door of the SUV opened with quiet precision, not rushed, not dramatic, just controlled, and a man stepped out, his presence immediately altering the space outside even before he spoke a word. Dressed in a tailored dark suit that fit with effortless perfection, his posture straight, his movements measured, the kind of presence that suggested influence without needing to announce it. And as he closed the door behind him, his eyes lifted toward the boutique, scanning the interior through the glass with a focus that was neither hurried nor uncertain. And inside, the subtle hum of conversation began to falter once more, not because of noise, but because of recognition. The kind that travels silently from one person to another until the room feels it all at once. And the associate near the window straightened slightly, her breath catching as realization began to form, while Vanessa, still unaware, adjusted a receipt and reached for the next customer, believing the story had already ended, not knowing that it was only just beginning. The man did not rush, and that was the first thing that made the difference. Because in a city that thrived on urgency, where every second carried weight and every step had purpose, his pace remained calm, deliberate, as if time itself adjusted to him rather than the other way around. And as he approached the glass doors of the boutique, the subtle reflection of his figure stretched across the polished surface, merging with the luxury behind it. And when he stepped inside, the soft chime of the door echoed louder than it should have, cutting through the gentle music and quiet conversations like a signal that something had shifted. And instantly, the atmosphere changed, not dramatically, not with noise, but with awareness, because several customers recognized him at once, their posture straightening, their expressions shifting from casual interest to quiet attention, and one of them whispered his name under her breath. Daniel Carter, the words barely audible, yet carrying enough weight to ripple through the room. And the younger associate near the entrance froze for a fraction of a second before stepping forward, her voice suddenly more careful, more respectful, asking if she could assist him. But Daniel did not respond immediately, his gaze moving slowly across the boutique, not searching for products, not admiring displays, but scanning, observing, measuring, until his eyes settled on Vanessa. And in that moment, something invisible tightened, as if the room itself held its breath. And Vanessa looked up, her professional smile forming instantly, the same polished expression she had perfected over years, unaware that it was about to be tested in a way she had never experienced before. And she stepped forward with confidence, greeting him with the refined tone reserved for high-value clients, asking how she could assist, her posture flawless, her voice controlled. But Daniel did not return the smile, his expression calm yet unreadable. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying a quiet authority that did not need to rise to be heard. He asked a simple question, "Where is she?" And for a brief second, Vanessa hesitated, confusion flickering across her face because the question did not match the interaction she expected, and she asked politely who he was referring to. And Daniel's gaze did not waver as he answered, "The woman who was just here, the one you asked to leave." And the words settled into the space with a weight that immediately shifted the balance of the room. And Vanessa felt it, a subtle but undeniable change, like standing on ground that was no longer steady. And she forced a small, controlled smile, explaining that there must have been a misunderstanding, that they occasionally had to manage situations where individuals did not align with the boutique standards. And as she spoke, Her tone remained professional, but there was a slight tightness now, something less certain than before, and Daniel listened without interruption, his eyes steady, his expression unchanged, and when she finished, he took a small step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance, and said quietly that the woman she had dismissed was his wife, and the room went completely still, not a single movement, not a single whisper, just silence, heavy and immediate. And Vanessa's expression froze mid-smile, the confidence she had built beginning to fracture beneath the realization forming in her mind. And before she could respond, before she could adjust, Daniel continued, his voice still calm, still measured, but carrying a clarity that left no room for doubt, explaining that Emily Carter did not need approval to belong anywhere, because she had spent years building the kind of life where belonging was never granted by others, only revealed. And the words were not loud, not dramatic, but they landed with a precision that echoed far beyond their volume. And in that moment, Vanessa understood that what she had dismissed as a minor inconvenience had already become something far greater, something irreversible, and the quiet certainty she once held began to unravel, piece by piece, under the weight of a truth she could no longer ignore. For a moment, no one moved, and the silence inside the boutique became something tangible, something heavy enough to feel pressing against every surface. And Vanessa stood there, her posture still perfectly aligned, but her expression no longer belonged to the confident woman who had been controlling the room just minutes ago, because now there was hesitation, real hesitation, the kind that cannot be hidden behind polished words. And her mind raced, trying to reassemble control from the fragments that were slipping away, and she forced a small, careful breath before speaking, her voice softer now, less certain, saying that there must have been some misunderstanding, that if his wife felt uncomfortable, they would be more than willing to correct the situation, to ensure a better experience. And the shift in tone was immediate, unmistakable, the authority she once held replaced by something closer to caution. And Daniel watched her quietly, his gaze steady, not hostile, not emotional, just observant, as if weighing not only her words but the intention behind them. And after a brief pause, he asked a single question, what exactly needed to be corrected? And the simplicity of it left no space to hide, no room for vague explanations. And Vanessa felt it again, that tightening in her chest, the realization that she was no longer guiding the conversation, she was responding to it. And she explained that perhaps there had been a misjudgment, that sometimes first impressions could lead to assumptions that were not entirely accurate. And as she spoke, her words became more careful, more deliberate, each one chosen with increasing awareness. And around them, the boutique remained completely still, the customers no longer pretending to browse, the associates no longer moving, every eye drawn to the quiet exchange unfolding at the center of the room. And Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging her explanation, but there was no relief in his expression, no sign that the situation had eased. And then he spoke again, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a clarity that cut through the tension, saying that first impressions do not reveal who someone is, they reveal who you choose to be. And the words settled deeply, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, leaving a silence that followed them like an echo. And Vanessa lowered her gaze for just a fraction of a second before lifting it again, her composure now carefully rebuilt, though no longer unshakable. And she asked if his wife was nearby, if she could return so that they could personally assist her, offer the dress, perhaps arrange something more exclusive. And Daniel's expression remained unchanged as he replied that Emily did not wait for permission to return anywhere, and that if she chose to come back, it would not be because she needed anything from them, but because she decided it was worth her time. And the distinction was subtle but undeniable, and Vanessa understood it, felt it, the shift from control to consequence. And for the first time since he entered, Daniel's gaze moved slightly, taking in the boutique, the displays, the staff, the carefully constructed image that now seemed fragile under scrutiny. And then he added quietly that respect is not something that can be offered after it has been withheld. And once again, the room fell deeper into silence, if that were even possible. And Vanessa stood there, absorbing every word, the weight of them settling into a realization she could not ignore, that this was no longer about a single interaction, no longer about a single customer, but about a decision that had already defined something far greater than she had intended. And outside, the city continued its steady motion, unaware that inside the boutique, everything had already changed. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the boutique like a held breath that no one dared release. And in that stillness, Vanessa became acutely aware of every detail around her. The faint hum of the air conditioning, the soft rustle of fabric as someone shifted their weight, the distant sound of traffic filtering in through the glass. All of it suddenly louder than it had ever been before. And yet none of it mattered compared to the presence standing directly in front of her. Because Daniel Carter was not raising his voice, he was not making a scene, but somehow his quiet control carried more weight than any confrontation ever could, and Vanessa realized, with a slow and undeniable clarity, that this was not a situation she could recover with politeness alone, because the foundation of what had happened had already been exposed, and there was no version of her earlier words that could now be softened into something acceptable, and she opened her mouth to speak again, to offer something more, something better, but before she could, Daniel's attention shifted slightly toward the rest of the boutique, his gaze moving across the staff, the customers, the environment that had once felt so carefully curated, and he asked another question, just as simple as the first: who else here believes that appearance defines worth? And the question did not demand an answer, but it filled the room with a kind of quiet pressure that made everyone aware of themselves, of their thoughts, of their silence, and no one spoke, not the customers who had watched, not the associates who had hesitated, because in that moment, silence became its own response, and Vanessa felt it more than anyone, the absence of support, the absence of certainty, and for the first time, she was not standing above the situation, she was standing inside it, exposed by it, and Daniel turned his gaze back to her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that felt even more definitive, and he said that luxury is not defined by price tags or polished floors. It is defined by how people are treated when no one is trying to impress them, and the words settled into the space with a finality that could not be undone, and Vanessa felt something shift within her, not just fear of consequence, but something deeper, the recognition of a line she had crossed without realizing how far it extended, and she straightened slightly, her composure returning in fragments. But her voice now carried something new, not confidence, not authority, but acknowledgement. And she said quietly that she had made a mistake, that her judgment had been wrong, and the admission hung in the air, simple, direct, without defense, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the tension might ease, like the story might find a softer resolution. But Daniel did not respond immediately, his expression unchanged, as if considering not just the words but their weight. And then he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and said that recognizing a mistake is the first step, but it does not erase the impact of it. And again, the room fell into that familiar silence, the kind that follows truth rather than conflict. And Vanessa lowered her gaze slightly, understanding now that this was not about fixing what had happened, it was about facing it. And around them, the boutique no longer felt like a place of control or exclusivity. It felt like a space that had been revealed, stripped of its illusion, and every person present seemed to feel it, that subtle but undeniable shift, as if something invisible had been turned inside out, and Daniel took a step back, not retreating, but creating distance, as if the moment had reached its natural conclusion. And yet there was still something unfinished, something waiting just beyond the edge of what had already been said, something that Vanessa could not yet see but could now sense, like the quiet before a final revelation. And outside, the black SUV remained parked, unmoving, its presence a reminder that this story had not yet reached its end. The moment lingered, suspended in a silence that no longer felt uncertain but inevitable, as if everything that had happened had been leading to something still unspoken, and Daniel stood there for a second longer before reaching into his jacket, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise. And when he pulled out his phone, the movement alone seemed to shift the atmosphere again, subtle but undeniable, and Vanessa watched closely now, no longer trying to control the situation but trying to understand it, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful attention to every detail. And Daniel made a brief call, his voice low, composed, stating only that he was inside and that it was time, and then he ended the call without explanation, slipping the phone back into his pocket as if nothing more needed to be said. And for a few seconds, nothing changed. The boutique remained still, the air thick with anticipation. And then the glass doors opened once more, and this time, Emily Carter stepped back inside, her presence quiet yet unmistakably different from before, not because she had changed, but because the room had, every eye turning toward her with a new awareness, a new understanding, and she walked in with the same calm steps, the same simple clothes. But now there was no confusion about her place, no hesitation in her movement, just a quiet certainty that seemed to fill the space around her. And Vanessa felt it immediately, that shift, that undeniable reversal, and as Emily approached, Daniel stepped slightly to the side, not in deference but in alignment, as if the moment now belonged to her. And Emily stopped a few feet from Vanessa, her expression composed, her eyes steady, and for a brief second, no one spoke, the silence returning once again. But this time it carried something different, not tension, but clarity, and Emily looked around the boutique, taking in the space, the people, the details she had seen before, but now through a different lens, and then she spoke, her voice soft but clear, saying that she appreciated honesty, that it revealed things quickly, and Vanessa swallowed slightly, nodding as if she understood, though the weight of the moment made it difficult to respond, and Emily continued, explaining that she had always believed that environments like this were not defined by exclusivity alone, but by the values they chose to uphold, and that today had revealed something important, not about the store, but about how easily assumptions can shape behavior. And her words were not accusatory, not harsh, but they carried a quiet authority that made them impossible to dismiss. And Daniel watched her with a calm expression, allowing her to speak, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. And Emily then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, understated card, holding it between her fingers for a moment before placing it gently on the counter in front of Vanessa. And Vanessa's eyes dropped to it, her breath catching slightly as she recognized the name printed there, not just Emily Carter, but the designation beneath it, one that connected her directly to the ownership group behind the boutique itself. And the realization hit not like a shock, but like a slow, undeniable wave, something that could not be resisted or denied. And Emily did not emphasize it, did not explain it. She simply let it exist, and then she looked back up, her expression unchanged, and said quietly that she had come in earlier as a customer. Nothing more, nothing less, and that the experience she had received was the only measure that truly mattered. And the room went completely still, not because of surprise alone, but because of the clarity of what had just been revealed. And Vanessa stood frozen for a moment, her understanding now complete, every assumption she had made unraveling in the face of a truth she could no longer escape. And in that silence, everything shifted, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of consequence settling into place. Vanessa's fingers hovered just above the card, as if touching it would make everything more real than she was prepared to accept, and the polished confidence she had carried all day dissolved into something quieter, something far more human, because now there was no misinterpretation, no assumption left to rely on, only the undeniable truth sitting in front of her. And for the first time since this began, she did not try to speak immediately. She did not rush to explain or justify. She simply stood there, absorbing the weight of what she had done, and Emily watched her without judgment, without satisfaction, just with a calm presence that made the moment feel even more exposed. And after a long second, Vanessa finally lifted her eyes, her voice softer than it had ever been, saying that she was sorry, not in the polished tone of customer service, but in a way that felt stripped of performance. And the apology hung in the air, simple and unprotected, and Emily nodded slightly, acknowledging it, but not reacting beyond that, because this was not a moment that could be resolved with a single word. And Daniel remained beside her, silent, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption, his presence steady but no longer the center of the room, because now the focus had shifted entirely to Emily, and she took a small step forward, her gaze moving briefly across the boutique, the staff, the customers, the carefully arranged displays that once symbolized exclusivity but now seemed to represent something else entirely. And then she spoke again, her voice calm, measured, saying that mistakes happen, that people make judgments every day without realizing the impact of them. But what matters is whether those moments are ignored or understood. And the words carried no anger, no accusation, only a quiet clarity that made them impossible to dismiss. And Vanessa listened, her posture no longer defensive, no longer controlled, just present. And Emily continued, explaining that she had no intention of making a spectacle, no intention of punishing or humiliating anyone, because that would only repeat the same behavior in a different form. And the room remained completely still, every person aware that they were witnessing something far more powerful than confrontation, something that did not rely on volume or force, but on truth. And Emily reached out and gently turned the card on the counter so it faced Vanessa fully, as if ensuring there was no distance left between them and what it represented. And then she added quietly that ownership is not about authority, it is about responsibility, and that the real value of any place like this is not measured by its price tags or its reputation, but by how it treats people when it believes no one important is watching. And the words settled deeply, not just with Vanessa, but with everyone in the room, because they recognized themselves in that statement, their silence, their assumptions, their choices. And Vanessa lowered her gaze again, nodding slowly, understanding now that this moment would not define her by the mistake alone, but by what she chose to do after it. And Emily stepped back slightly, the distance creating space not for escape, but for reflection. And after a brief pause, she said that she would return another day, not as a test, not as a statement, but simply as a customer, and that what happened then would matter more than anything said today. And with that, she gave a small, polite nod, the same one she had given when she first entered, unchanged despite everything that had unfolded. And she turned toward the door, Daniel following beside her, their movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing more needed to be proven. And as they stepped out onto the street, the boutique remained silent, no one speaking, no one moving, the weight of the moment lingering long after they had gone. And Vanessa stood behind the counter, the card still in front of her, the reflection of the glass doors showing her not as she had seen herself before, but as she now understood herself to be. And in that quiet realization, something shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply enough that it would not be forgotten, because that day, the boutique did not lose a customer. It gained a lesson that would echo far beyond its walls, and the room, once filled with quiet judgment, now held something else entirely, a stillness shaped by understanding, and a truth that no longer needed to be spoken aloud.